Hi everybody, welcome back to Happy Little Diodes. Today I've got this fancy new microphone on. It's quite smart, isn't it? I think they sound much better as well. Oh yeah, we're going to be doing a bit more on the Nucleon today. Thankfully, no more SMD parts to do, so no more SMD soldering gore for you to endure. We're just going to start pulling parts out of the kit and see how far we get. So this is as far as we got at the end of the last video. We have all of our SMD components in place, and as you can see we have about 10 million more components to place. So let's turn the bag upside down and decide where to begin. I didn't want to start with anything big like chips and sockets. I think capacitors is the right place to go. So let's start with this random bag of caps that I've picked off the top of the pile. There are a couple of larger electrolytics in here. These both sit around the power circuit. This one is C97 and the other one with the lower voltage rating is C98. It's time to heat up our soldering iron, and that's going to take about 30 seconds, so I'm going to race it with the Rubik's Cube, obviously. Hey, he's still got it. Thankfully these two caps are pretty big, it's very easy to find them on the board. I'm going to have a lot of trouble later on with all these small components trying to find where they're meant to go. C97, C98, they lie down like this. There's a lovely little footprint for them drawn onto the PCB. Let's try and get them to line up nice and neat and start as we mean to go on. So here we go with our first through-hole joint of the build. Well, I guess we can't be perfect. This capacitors package is a bit too big for the footprint on the board. There's always going to be variation, so let's work with what we have. Moving on, there goes C98 into its place. Cool, there's our first two capacitors in place. What else did we have in that little bag? There were a couple of smaller capacitors like this one. Come on, focus. Hang on. Like this one. Nope. Wait. This. Nope. This one. This one with 22 written on it. That's a 22 picofarad capacitor at C94. This is one of the optional capacitors actually, which goes around our PAL encoder chip, IC47. Because we have the BH7236AF, we have to fit C94. C91 and C92 also came out of this bag, so let's fit those as well. Okay, one bag down. What's the next one saying? We have two electrolytics, C88 and C89, and then C82, 85 and 86. Here's our electrolytics. These sit around the MAX662 chip. More on that in a minute, that's a really interesting chip. Here they go into their slots and they don't quite sit flush, which is annoying. I'd like them all to sit perfectly flush, but never mind, we'll work with what we have. The other caps in this bag were this lovely green 1.2 nanofarad capacitor and two 1 nanofarad capacitors in this funky little package here. But before we put those in, let's just have another look at C85 and C86. They sit around this MAX662 CPA chip, and what this does is it uses charge pumps to generate 12 volts from 5 volts. Kind of similar to the 48K power circuit, which we're all so familiar with. But this did get me thinking that you might be able to power this thing from USB if you had a 5 volt supply. Seems to only need a single 5 volt supply. The only downside I could see is that the 9 volt supply to the edge connector would be missing. Anyway, while I've been rambling, I've found where C82 goes. There's a little via there, and I'm just being careful that I don't put the capacitor in wrong. I've done this before by putting a leg through a via, just testing what's going on here and I need to be careful not to short to that via, because then I would just be bypassing the capacitor. And just quickly checking that I didn't put too much solder in, and no, everything's fine. Moving on to C85 and C86, here they are right next to IC51, which is our 12 volt generator. These sit nice and low and flush and neat, which I'm very happy about. Let's solder these 4 legs in place and move on to our next bag of bits. Alright, moving on, we are not remotely finished with capacitors yet. Here we have C60 to C77 electrolytics and a single polyester capacitor. Most of these electrolytics are decoupling capacitors, that's C60 to C73 as you can see here, but we also have some fairly interesting ones such as C74, which forms part of our reset circuit. This is a component we're quite familiar with from our toast rack repair videos when we've had machines with startup issues. As you might expect, these decoupling capacitors all sit next to chips here and there all over the board, so now starts the job of finding all those locations. I am a fan of this mossy green and gold capacitor colour scheme. Don't think it goes particularly well with the purple, but what a nice looking little part. Obviously, we're being careful with polarity of these electrolytics. Thankfully, the positive is marked on the board for every single one, so I can't really go wrong, although I wouldn't put it past me. We're starting to get somewhere now. It's starting to look a little bit more like a computer and less like a kit of parts. There was one more capacitor in that bag, that's this little polyester capacitor. We'll get this one fitted before picking a new bag. Next up we have C104, 150 picofarads, Styroflex, whatever that means, and 55 of these 100 nanofarad, mostly decoupling capacitors. This is the Styroflex capacitor. It looks a lot like the polyester one we just fitted. Let's get that one in place first before taking on those other 55. This is where it sits in the middle of the board and it is now in place. So what about all these other ones? I'm not going to make you watch me put all of those in, so here we go. Easy peasy. You may have different results if you try that on your own kits. As I mentioned earlier, these are mostly decoupling. C1 to C47 are all decoupling capacitors. So what about the other ones? Anything interesting there? Well, C50, 51 and 52 are on our RGB lines to our PAL encoder. That's kind of interesting. But that's about it really, the other ones weren't so interesting. But let's have a close look at them all in place. A little army of capacitors. And for our next bag, C56 to C59, 150 nanofarad, we have C105 and C106, and C87. And here are those three all together, these kind of spindly dark brown capacitors. These are not so interesting, although C106 is in our clock circuit. The other four, that's C56 through 59, are in these nice boxy yellow packages, and they are all involved with the audio circuit, which handles the tape in and out, audio in and out. I think it does stereo too. All 4 of these sit up at the back of the board here, next to the audio sockets. I don't think they're going to fit. Let's have a look. Yeah, C87 is going to be a bit tight in the middle there. I hope that's a thin package. I'm sure we can make it work. What about C58 and 59? Well, 58 drops in nicely, but it is barging in on C59 space, and I don't think they're going to sit very neatly. Yeah, that's not really good enough. I think I'm going to bend the legs on the bottom of the top capacitor, and yeah, here's the result. That's a little bit neater, and I think we can just about access the joints for the resistor there, above to the right. And fingers crossed that this one can slide in between, and yeah, it can. That's alright. I think I'm happy with that. We also had C105 and C106 to place. These are miles away from each other and took me ages to find them. There's 105 and here's 106 on the other end of the board. Right, what's in our next bag? We have a few electrolytics C78 through 81 and C100 through 103. Although C81 had an asterisk next to it, we'll have to look into that. We also have these tiny little weird packaged 1 nanofarad capacitors. Let's get those 2 in first. C84 and the other one I think was C83. We have 3 10 microfarad electrolytics, although there were 4 capacitors listed on the bag. One of them was C81, which is related to the PAL encoder chip, and the kind of chip that we have means we don't need to fit C81. So there wasn't one missing and I didn't actually need to panic. And finally we have 4 220 microfarad caps, again in this lovely green colour. Let's get them in place. Okay, next bag, C93, C99, C90 and C95. I see a cool little blue capacitor in there, let's have a look at that. Yeah, that's a nice package, that's a 22 nanofarad. Guy lives down here in the bottom right of the board in the C93 location. We'll fit this one first. Whatever you do, don't slip now. Lovely. Just a couple more fairly uninteresting parts to fit here. We have this 150 picofarad capacitor and 2 of these 47 picofarad capacitors. The 47s didn't line up perfectly, but I kinda like the way one is poking its head out from behind the other. Now we've got plenty more to go, but I wanted to do a bit of housekeeping and clean up all these millions of legs that I've been chopping off. because that gives us a nice clean start to the transistor phase, which is actually much shorter. There's only 6 transistors on this entire board, can you believe it? Here we have T1 to T4, all in a nice little line. These all sit around this busy cluster of transistors, resistors and capacitors on the bottom left of the board here. Let's start work on this. I can't wait to see this section complete. I am putting a lot of faith in the silk screen here. I'm not checking the leg configuration of these transistors because it's drawn onto the silk screen which way around they should go in. There we are, there's our first 4 transistors in place. Let's have a look at what they do. T1, 2 and 3 are actually drivers for our RGB signals. It's kind of interesting. And T4 is also some kind of driver for a synchronization signal, which I find quite interesting because I've been learning about how the ULA works recently. So next transistor, T5. This is another interesting one. It's used in the generation of the color subcarrier input to our PAL encoder chip. According to the datasheet, this can be a sine wave or a pulse wave. I'm guessing we've gone with pulse wave because we've generated a digital input. Our last transistor is T6 and that has a really cool package. Look at this, it's like a metallic cylinder with a tab on it so that we can place it in the correct orientation. This is where it sits in the middle of the board and the tab is actually drawn onto the silk screen, which is really nice, so I can't really get this wrong. Now we move on to resistors, and there's about 10 billion resistors to fit. I'm just going to show you 1 or 2 and then we're going to magic the rest in. Just checking the values. I did do this for all of the resistors that I fitted. Now here's how they go in. They're kind of stood on their end, which is quite interesting. Obviously we're really pushed for space to fit such a powerful machine onto such a small board, and it gets quite fiddly trying to identify what goes where, such as R4 here. We can see that the little white line telling me where to put it kind of wiggles its way into the middle here, and that's where it has to go. So yeah, I had to take a lot of care here, and I did cock up one of them which I fixed later on when I thankfully spotted the cock up. Yeah, this is nice. We're starting to finish off this section here. I like to see the different sections get completed. It makes me feel like I'm making some good progress. As I mentioned earlier, we have a whole lot of resistors to fit. So I think we're going to magic them in rather than watch me fit them all individually, unless you want me to do that. No, I thought not. There we are. I'll give you that 2 hours of your life back for free. I am starting to wonder what the odds are that this is going to boot first time. There's a lot of room for error here. I've been very careful, although I was very careful with the last Nucleon I built, and that didn't boot first time. And we'll have to wait and see. Next I'm going to fit some diodes. So in here we have D1 to 13 and a couple of Zener diodes. D1 to 8 are on our keyboard connector. The same keyboard circuit is used here as is in the original Spectrum. and they have these two Zener diodes in this kind of opposing relationship, which is kind of interesting. Appears to be a waveform clipper in use in the audio circuit. Cool. I did panic when I couldn't find D12 and 13, I thought I'd been shortchanged. However, I fitted them in the last video. They're surface mount diodes, so no panic there. The keyboard connectors are in the same place, obviously, because this is compatible with a normal speccy case. So over here on the right we have our 8-way keyboard connector, where we'll fit these 8 diodes. The Zener diodes are in a funky little package. Never seen this one before, kinda like it. Quite easy to see which way it goes. These two go in here at the top of the board to form our little waveform clipper circuit that we just learned about. Well, we're nearly done for today. If you're still with me, we'll go on to these resistor networks. Since we were doing resistors, there are 3 of them to fit, and thankfully they all have different numbers of legs, so it should be fairly easy to put them in the right place. I suppose I could put them in the wrong way around, but they are marked with these little dots which are also printed onto the board, so I'll be doing well if I manage to mess this one up. And easy peasy, you can see the dot on the board lines up with the dot on the package, and we're away. Here's the second of the 3, alongside the keyboard connector on the left hand side of the board. And finally we have this big massive one in the middle, which is actually our network of pull-up resistors for the data bus. And the last thing I'm going to fit today is our 2 crystals, which are the basis of our 2 clock circuits. One for our PAL encoder colour subcarrier, which we saw earlier, and one for our ULA circuitry and ultimately the Z80 clock. The legs have got these little kinks in them to stop them from sitting flat on the board, which I'm a bit upset about. I like things to be flush to the board, but I understand why they've done it, and I'm going to straighten them out and fit them as close as I can to the board without it touching, just like that. And that's just about it for today. Let's just have a little look around at what we've achieved so far. There's our clock and our row of diodes. Here's the tape in-out circuitry, and all around the board we can see millions of capacitors and resistors and transistors, which we've fitted hopefully correctly. We'll find out in the next video, after we fit all of the chips and connectors and buttons, if we've made any mistakes. And to be honest with you, I've been fairly careful here. Apart from this bent resistor, I'll just straighten that up. There we go. Yeah, I've been fairly careful, and I'm fairly confident that this is going to boot first time as long as there aren't any bad parts, as I haven't been testing the parts as I've been fitting them. Where does that leave us for next time then? Let's have a look at what we've done so far. The board's starting to get a bit of weight to it, which is nice. Nice to feel it getting a bit hefty and a bit more like a computer and less like a kit. Overall, pretty happy with the progress. Let's have a look at the rest of the kit. There's a few bags left. We've got chips and more chips. Loads and loads of chips, and I'm not planning on soldering any of them in. I'm going to put sockets in for all of them. The other bags have more chips. And what about this one? Oh, more chips again. You see, there's a whole ULA that's been turned into normal LS chips here, so there's a billion chips. Here's some more chips. That must be it for the chips, surely. What's the next bag? Oh, more chips. Yeah, the Z80 is quite important. We also have a load of chips, sorry, more chips. Okay, what about the next bag? Come on, give me something that's not chips. Okay, connectors. We have keyboard connectors to go in, of course. We have a push button switch for the back, as well as some other jacks and a pin header for some jumpers for configuring the board. And here are the sockets that have been provided, and there aren't enough for all of the chips, but I do have a box full of them, so I'm hoping, as I mentioned earlier, to have every single chip in a socket or as close as possible to that. So there we have it. I hope you enjoyed that, and stick around for the next video where we'll be finishing the build and booting it up for the first time.